Our journey starts in the northeast of New York State at Lake Champlain, before heading west into the Adirondack Park and then turning north to Lake Placid. From there it's west across the state to the St. Lawrence River and the Thousand Islands, before following the shoreline of Lake Ontario to Rochester. We then fly west to the end of the Niagara River before heading upstream to one of the wonders of the natural world, the Niagara Falls. Lake Champlain acts as the border between Vermont and New York and runs for about 110 miles. Towards the southern end is a peninsula on the New York side with an old fort at its end. Crown Point Fort was built by the British and provincial troops in 1758 to secure the region from the French. It's the largest earthen fortress in the United States. On the same site are the remnants of a French fort built 20 years earlier, which was attacked twice by the British before being destroyed by the French as they retreated. But the newer and much larger fort was never directly assaulted by the French and was eventually only manned by a small unit of men. A decade later, it offered no resistance to the Americans at the beginning of the War of Independence. The fort was abandoned in 1780 and is now a National Historic Landmark. Flying west from Lake Champlain, and the vast Adirondack Park opens up. Today, around 6 million acres are protected by a state constitution of 1894, which said that the lands of the state, now owned or hereafter acquired, constituting the forest preserve, as now fixed by law, shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, public or private, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed. In the 1950s and 60s, the Adirondack Northway was built, which carves its way through the park and is part of the Interstate 87 route. Contrary to the concept of an interstate, this one doesn't actually leave New York State, making it actually an intrastate freeway, and it is the longest one in the country. The park contains thousands of streams, brooks, and lakes, all surrounded by natural forest. Beaverflow Lake is just one of the thousands that visitors can enjoy in almost complete seclusion. Hunting and fishing are allowed in the park, although in certain areas there are strict regulations. As a result, the lakes are not overfished and are well stocked with trout and black bass. One of the reasons for strict environmental controls in the late 19th century was to manage the lumber industry and iron ore mining. And as late as 1940, a titanium dioxide mine was begun in the Tahawas region. It closed in 1989, and with the march of time, less and less of the mine works are visible, as nature begins to take over. The area does, however, have an interesting claim to fame, as it was here on a hunting trip that Theodore Roosevelt learnt that President McKinley was dying and that he could shortly become the next president. The village of Lake Placid, which sits at the southern end of the lake with the same name, has a place in the history books as one of only 3 places in the world which has held 2 Winter Olympic Games. The first was in 1932 and the second in 1980. Lake Placid was founded back in the early 1800s for mining, but today centres on a range of winter sports. The ski jumps seen today have replaced both those built in wood for the 1932 Olympics and also the jumps erected for the 1980 Games. One reason is that current rules demand heights of 90 and 120 metres. Back in 1980, it was only 70 and 90 metres. Even the old 1980 Olympic flame cauldron still stands where all the athletes gathered for the opening ceremony. The weather in the Adirondack Park can change in a matter of minutes. But even if the landscape is draped in low cloud and mist, its beauty can still be appreciated for its dramatic splendour. This enormous park occupies about a quarter of New York State, and much of it is a wilderness, with only a few intrepid visitors venturing into the remoter parts, where in the distant past Mohawk Indians once hunted. West of the Adirondack Park is the DeGrasse State Forest, one of 40 such state forests, which are heavily protected and together add up to around 19 million acres. The Thousand Islands is the name of an archipelago which straddles the border between the United States and Canada in the St. Lawrence River. The islands run for about 50 miles, and the Canadian islands are in the province of Ontario, with the American islands in the state of New York. There are, in fact, many more islands than 1,000, and actually number close to 1,800, ranging in size from 40 square miles to islands occupied by a single residence, and even smaller uninhabited rocks that are home to migratory waterfowl. The number of islands has been determined using the criteria that any island must be above water level all year round, bigger than 1 square foot, and support at least 1 living tree. The area is very popular among vacationers, campers and boaters, and is often referred to as the freshwater boating capital of the world. During the late 19th century, several fantasy castles were built on the islands for wealthy industrialists. Singer Castle on Dark Island is one of them. It was originally called the Towers, and the inspiration for its design came from castles mentioned in the novels of the Scottish writer Sir Walter Scott. It was built for the sewing machine magnate Frederick Gilbert Bourne, president of the Singer Manufacturing Company. He died shortly after the castle was completed, and since then it has changed hands several times. The castle comes complete with dungeons, peepholes, and underground passageways. A few miles upriver and past other islands is another fantasy castle, which has a tragic story behind it, and left the castle on Hart Island deserted for 73 years. A hart deer stands proudly on the roof of Bolt Castle, designed to be one of the largest private houses in America. The 6-story castle was going to be an international landmark, and the island was to have other fantasy buildings as well. The castle was named after George Bolt, who owned hotels including the Waldorf Astoria in New York. He employed hundreds of workers to begin the building program in 1900 for him and his family. 4 years later, all work stopped, as tragically his wife suddenly died, and George Bolt simply halted the work, never setting foot on the island again. The house was bought in 1977 by a conservation body for $1, on the understanding it would be restored back to life. To date, some $15 million has been spent. On one end of the island is a small Gothic castle, which was to house the power plant that would supply electricity for the house. And on the other end of the island is Ulster Tower, a rustic-style folly. On an adjacent island is Bolt Yacht House, which could house several tall-masted boats. It also has a distinctive design, complementing the other astonishing buildings on Hart Island itself. A passing storm provides a magical light and also clears the skies over Lake Ontario. This is the smallest of the 5 Great Lakes and the most easterly. The lake is filled by the Niagara River and flows out down the St. Lawrence River. It covers an area of around 7,500 square miles, has a maximum depth of 602 feet and a shoreline of 712 miles. The cool wind that comes off the lake tends to slow down the fruit blossom until the spring frost dangers has passed. This makes it an ideal area for fruit growing, and peaches, apples, cherries, pears and plums are grown along this coastal strip. Just inland from the coast, a certain Colonel Nathaniel Rochester, along with 2 colleagues, bought a 100-acre site in 1803. Rochester was founded. Today, the city has the 2nd largest regional economy in the state and has a population of just over 200,000 people, making it the 3rd largest city after New York and Buffalo. Within 40 years of its founding, Rochester was known as Flower City and had become not only the largest flower-producing centre in the United States, but also America's first boomtown. When the flower industry moved west in the mid-19th century, a different type of flower industry took over, and Rochester began to be surrounded by plant nurseries. Rochester is also known as the world's image centre, because it was here in 1892 that George Eastman founded the Kodak Company. An early slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest." Kodak also pioneered film for the movie industry with 35mm and 16mm formats, which are still being used today. George Eastman built himself a house in the Rochester suburbs in 1902. At the time, his colonial revival-style house was surrounded by 10 acres of working farmland, as well as formal gardens. The house also boasted a built-in vacuum cleaning system, a central clock network, and an internal telephone exchange with 21 extensions. Today, this National Historic Landmark is home to a museum devoted to photography, as well as the conservation of both film and photographs. It also houses one of the oldest film archives in the world. In the mid-19th century, Rochester was at the forefront of the abolitionist movement and even had its own newspaper devoted to the cause. And in this house, Susan B. Anthony, an early civil rights supporter, tirelessly campaigned for abolition as well as championing women's rights. She was to play a pivotal role during the 19th century to introduce women's suffrage into the country. She died in 1906, 14 years before the 19th Amendment was finally passed in 1920, giving women the right to vote. A few miles up the coast, at the entrance to the Niagara River, is a fort which has seen three nations both attack it as well as defend it: Fort Niagara. It was the French who first built a wooden stockade here in 1678 and then replaced it with a fort in 1726. 30 years later, it fell to the British after a 19-day siege called the Battle of Fort Niagara. During the War of Independence, the fort remained in the hands of the Loyalists, but was ceded to the new American nation after the war. However, in the subsequent War of 1812, the British captured the fort again, only to give it back again after the war ended. It has remained in US hands ever since. Much of what we see today was built in the post-Civil War era of the mid-19th century. The new earth ramparts withstood cannon fire better than masonry walls. It was only in 1963 that the US military finally deactivated the fort, though a military presence in the form of the US Coast Guard still uses part of the site, making Fort Niagara one of the longest continuously run military bases in the United States. After the British withdrew following their defeat in the War of Independence, they did not move very far, in fact, just over the river, where they built Fort George. The fort became the headquarters of the British Army and local militia, and during the War of 1812 was captured by the Americans at the Battle of Fort George. However, it was retaken 8 months later. It has remained in Canadian hands ever since, and only ceased having a military presence in 1965. Both forts are now National Historic Sites. The Niagara River acts as the border between the US and Canada, and 3 bridges handle the enormous number of border crossings each day. The newest is the Lewiston-Queenston Bridge. It was built in 1960, and all the lanes are reversible depending on the flow of traffic between the two countries. Next to the border crossing are 2 enormous hydroelectric power stations. They were built in the late 1950s and at the time were the largest such facility in the world. The flow of water is regulated during the tourist season by a treaty between the US and Canada so as not to lessen the dramatic flow over the falls. 10,000 years ago, the falls would have been here, and erosion has steadily moved them back upriver by nearly 7 miles. Erosion has also created the whirlpool, where the river goes through a 90-degree turn. The speed and flow of the water has carved out a bowl 120 feet deep. For a great vantage point of the whirlpool, the cable car offers a pretty good breathtaking view. Amazingly, it was built nearly 200 years ago by Spanish engineers in 1816. There are 2 cities with the name Niagara Falls, and they stand opposite each other overlooking the falls. One in the US and the other in Canada. Both came into prominence at the end of the 19th century due to tourism as well as industry, which used the massive amount of power generated by the river. Visitors in their thousands come to see the falls, and many hotels and restaurants have been built to take advantage of the view. Perhaps the most dramatic is the Skylon Tower. Built in the 1960s, it is 520 feet high and offers dramatic views, particularly of the American Falls. The Niagara Falls are divided into two major sections, separated by Goat Island: the Horseshoe Falls, which are mainly in Canada, and the American Falls, with the much smaller Bridal Veil Falls in the United States. The American Falls only receive about 10% of the flow from the Niagara River, with the rest dropping over the Horseshoe Falls. The height of the falls is just under 200 feet, and the length of the relatively straight lip is roughly 900 feet. In 1969, the US Army Corps of Engineers blocked the flow of water for 6 months to see if they could prevent erosion by removing the talus, the sloping mass of rock fragments at the base of the falls. It was decided to leave it alone and let nature take its inevitable course. Visitors can watch the American Falls from the rocky base, or by boat, or perhaps the most dramatic view is from the Prospect Point Park Observation Tower. Even more impressive are the Horseshoe Falls. The facts about the Horseshoe Falls are quite impressive. It's over 2,000 feet wide around the curve. At the centre, the water is 10 feet deep and passes over the crest at 20 miles an hour. The height of the falls is around 180 feet, and the depth of water below the falls is almost the same at near 190 feet. The mist, which resembles smoke, often makes the falls difficult to see. In fact, if it was not for human interference and building underground channels to control the current for the hydroelectric plants, the amount of mist at maximum flow would make it almost impossible to see the falls at all. In 1829, Sam Patch jumped from a tarn to the gorge at the bottom of the falls and survived. He started a long tradition of daredevils going over the falls. A 63-year-old woman called Annie Edson Taylor was the first person to actually go over the falls in a barrel in 1901. She survived. Just. Since then, there have been several attempts, some successful and some fatal. Anyone attempting it today and surviving will be arrested and face stiff fines. In 1960, visitors watched in horror as a 7-year-old boy, Roger Woodward, was swept over the falls with only a life vest. He had been playing upstream with his sister, who was plucked from the river only 20 feet before the falls. He survived, and ever since, his incredible ordeal has been known as the Miracle at Niagara. Well over 20 million people a year come to witness one of the most breathtaking sights in the world, and a perfect place to end this aerial journey.